Hey everybody, welcome to Apocalypse Rising. Thanks for tuning in. I already know you think I'm going to talk about the election, but I'm not. I'm going to let that kind of play out because it's nowhere near being done at the moment. And Andrew and I decided we were going to make a podcast kind of live stream thing last night and watch the election results. And it turned into a shit show real quick. It went downhill fast. Breakfast! We had the bright idea that we were going to take a shot every time a state turned colors, and they were turning colors all night. So we got pretty messed up and stayed up too late. So I decided I needed to get back on track and talk about climate change. And so I found another article. I think you can guess where it came from. And it's another phys.org article. And this one here is from November 2nd, 2020. So a couple days old. And this article is talking about soil carbon release. So that would be, stored carbon in the soil gets released after the planet reaches about 2 degrees Celsius above average. And right now, the Arctic is already 5 degrees Celsius above average.
Damn, Daniel.
And there's no end in sight in terms of the global temperature rise. So we'll see 2 degrees Celsius pretty quickly. And I wanted to talk about this today because we talked about the ice and the positive feedback loop that melting ice and methane create. And we talked about geoengineering and how maybe that could help with climate change. We talked about fusion and maybe how that could help. And next we'll talk about carbon sequestration. But this right here might put a little hamper in that idea as well, because what this is talking about is how global warming of 2 degrees Celsius would lead to about 230 billion tons of carbon being released from the world's soil. So now we're talking about, as the planet heats up, soil also releases carbon and puts greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which will warm the planet further. Global soils contain 2 to 3 times more carbon than the atmosphere, and higher temperatures speed up decomposition, reducing the amount of time carbon spends in the soil, known as soil carbon turnover. So this has a lot of ramifications. Plants and stuff use the carbon as well, and they absorb the carbon and basically put it into the soil, and then the soil holds it. Well, as the planet heats up, it starts to release that carbon, and now you've got another positive feedback loop to add on top of the melting ice positive feedback loop. The new international research study led by the University of Exeter reveals the sensitivity of soil carbon turnover to global warming and subsequently halves uncertainty about this in future climate change projections. So what I find interesting about this is that they mention the uncertainty of climate change projections. This is one of my biggest beefs with how we look at what we're facing when it comes to climate change. We're using climate change projections that are still uncertain. They're trying to find a sweet spot where, they're not alarmist, they're not involved in hyperbole, they're not fear mongering, like my favorite things to do. They're trying to stay away from those scenarios. And then they're also trying to stay away from lulling us into a sense of complacency by saying, oh, it's going to be fine. It's no big deal. We'll just change to electric cars and it'll be all good. They're trying to find that balance in between. And the more and more they do studies, the more they realize that their climate change projections are uncertain at best. Breakfast! So the estimated 230 billion tons of carbon released at 2 degrees Celsius warming above pre-industrial levels is more than 4 times the total emissions from China and more than double the emissions from the US over the last 100 years. So this is what I'm talking about. We could change to all solar, all wind, all electric cars. And if we're already at 2 degrees Celsius warming above pre-industrial levels, then the emissions that's going to come from the carbon cycle in the soil is going to be more than anything we've put out or China's put out into the atmosphere over the last 100 years. So how do you stop that? Once that starts, how do you counteract that? I mean, you could stop doing everything that we're doing now that has to do with putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and the soil will go ahead and take over and do way more than we've ever done.
He needs some milk.
That's the real problem with what's going on now. This is no longer, oh, if we slow down what we're doing, then we'll cool the planet down and these things won't happen. The ice is already melting and putting methane into the atmosphere. That means the planet's going to continue to warm. The soil will put out carbon into the atmosphere, and that will continue to warm up the planet. Not to mention that when you're talking about, soil carbon, you have to think about forests and things. Those trees suck up the carbon dioxide and put it into the soil, but all the trees are burning, and that's just releasing the carbon back into the atmosphere as well. So it's getting kind of sketchy in terms of positive feedback loops. Now there's more than one that has been triggered, in my opinion. Now it says that their study rules out the most extreme projections, but nonetheless suggests substantial soil carbon losses due to climate change at only 2 Celsius warming. And this doesn't even include losses of deeper permafrost carbon. Okay, this right here I have a big problem with, because as we're talking about the melting ice, we also have to talk about the thawing permafrost, which is occurring, and that's also putting out methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And then you've got the regular soil that could potentially release more than the United States and China has in the last 100 years. So they're not even considering the permafrost.
You are so dumb. You are really dumb, for real.
Which is huge. And that's how they keep this from being in such a dire situation. And here they call it a positive feedback loop, which if you're listening to me, you've heard me say positive feedback loop a million times. You know what that means. It just basically compounds exponentially the issue at hand. And the response of soil carbon to climate change is the greatest area of uncertainty in understanding the carbon cycle in climate change projections. So this clearly states, this whole sentence right here states that in many of climate change projection models, soil carbon release, ice melting release, and permafrost release is not really put into their projections.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
So that's interesting to note. What happens when you put those things in the projections? What does it look like? Probably a lot different than what they're telling us. And that's kind of why I'm here, because I want to dig into this and figure out really how dire the situation is. To address this, the researchers used a new combination of observational data and Earth system models, which simulate the climate and carbon cycle and subsequently make climate change predictions. So they're just predicting using models, and they're doing it differently than they have in the past. Clearly, they're trying to hone in on this, but as soon as they come up with a new way to model, a new observational perspective, the planet just keeps getting hotter and hotter. And so, we've got to be careful with thinking far into the future. Oh, climate change is something we don't have to worry about until 2050 or 2100, when they're not even putting permafrost carbon into their current climate change models.
21?
Which could reduce that all the way down to 2030. So state-of-the-art models suggest an uncertainty of about 120 billion tons of carbon. So there's just, I keep seeing these words, uncertainty. Yeah, sure, they might reduce the uncertainty here, but it's still, it's uncertain. And that's really where we're at here. So what we're going to do from here is we'll move on to sequestration and see if that is going to provide us any kind of reprieve, because in my opinion, we're going to have to just throw everything at it and see what happens. Because if we sit here and do nothing, the planet is going to take over with positive feedback loops, and there's really going to be nothing we can do about it. So that's all I have to say about that article. I wanted to keep it kind of short today, keep the ball rolling, and move on to sequestration probably tomorrow or Friday. It was interesting doing a podcast with Andrew. It's been a long time since we tried doing anything like that, and obviously we're a little bit rusty, but my idea is just to do like maybe one major podcast a week, maybe on a Friday night, kind of just shoot the shit. But I think with Edge of Discord, which is kind of our podcasting channel, he's got some different ideas for that. So we'll have to work around it, and I might just go ahead and do like a longer shoot the shit podcast on this channel on like a Friday night or something like that. So hopefully everybody's doing well, hunkering down. There's not riots in the street yet, but we'll see what happens with the election. It's pretty crazy. It's a lot closer than people thought. So I'm sure it's going to get drug out with litigation, and really we don't switch the presidents until January 20th or something anyway. So we've got all this time to have a lame duck president who doesn't want to leave if they lost, and is going to contest it all the way to the end. So it's a wild card. And that's why I keep saying it, the decisions that we make in the next 3 to 6 months are really going to determine if we're able to address climate change in a meaningful way. And I'm not saying that if we're able to address it, it's going to make it better, or that we can reverse what's already been done. But we've got to give it a valiant effort, at least. Go down trying. Don't just ignore it, turn a blind eye to it, and keep on blazing down the path we're blazing down now, because it's just going to end up with everybody ablaze.
Allahu Akbar!
So I think that's all I have to say today. One of these days I'll make a positive video. I doubt it. Anyway, we'll see you next time.
Hey.